The winter of 1872 came to Crow's End, Maine, like a curse wrapped in ice. The snow fell without sound, blanketing the narrow streets in a silence so complete it felt suffocating. Every footstep crunched too loud. Every breath hung visible in the frozen air, as if the town itself was exhaling ghosts. The bare branches of elm trees clawed at the gray sky, black against white, skeletal fingers reaching toward nothing. Along the rocky coastline, the Atlantic Ocean crashed against jagged cliffs with a violence that seemed personal, as if the sea itself harbored a grudge against the land. Crow's End was dying. Everyone knew it. They just didn't say it out loud. Built on fishing, lumber, and the stubborn pride of its 300 residents, the town clung to the edge of America like a barnacle to a sinking ship. The harbor, once crowded with vessels bringing in cod and mackerel by the barrel, now sat mostly empty. Only a handful of weather-beaten boats remained, their paint peeling, their ropes frayed. The sawmill at the edge of town had closed 2 years prior, leaving 30 men without work and twice as many families without hope. The Civil War had ended 7 years ago, but its shadow still stretched long over places like Crow's End. The men who returned came back different, quieter, harder, with eyes that looked past you rather than at you. Some didn't return at all. Their names were carved into a granite monument in the town square, beside the church that smelled of damp wood and disappointment. This was a place where secrets grew like mold in dark corners, where everyone knew everyone else's business, yet somehow, nobody knew anything at all. Main Street ran straight through the heart of Crow's End like a scar. On one side stood the general store, owned by Edmund Whitlock, a wiry man of 52 with permanent ink stains on his fingers and a habit of watching people too long when they entered his shop. His wife had died in childbirth 15 years ago. The baby died too. Edmund never remarried. Some said he talked to his wife's photograph when he closed up at night. Across the street, the Greyhound Tavern leaked yellow lamplight and the sour smell of beer into the winter darkness. Its proprietor, Silas Cord, was a bear of a man with a thick gray beard and knuckles scarred from decades of breaking up fights. He'd fought at Gettysburg, though he never spoke of it. But sometimes, late at night, the regulars would hear him whispering to himself behind the bar, names mostly. Lists of names that went on and on. At the north end of town stood the schoolhouse, a single-room building painted white, though the paint had long since begun to peel. Miss Caroline Mercer, 28 years old, taught all grades together. She had pale blonde hair she wore in a tight bun, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a way of looking at children that made them feel simultaneously seen and judged. She'd come from Boston 3 years ago, running from something, people whispered, though no one knew what. And then there was Reverend Thomas Ashford, who preached at the Congregational Church every Sunday to a congregation that dwindled each year. He was a tall man, gaunt, with deep-set eyes and hands that trembled slightly when he raised them in prayer. His sermons had grown darker over the years, full of fire and judgment, warnings about sin lurking in respectable homes, about wickedness hiding behind civilized faces. These were the pillars of Crow's End, the watchful eyes, the keepers of order in a place where order was as fragile as winter ice. But beneath the surface of this dying town, something else stirred. Something that had been waiting, patient and cold, for exactly the right moment to emerge. The Graves family lived at the southern edge of town, where the forest pressed close and the road turned to frozen mud. Their house was a 2-story structure of weathered clapboard, gray as ash, with a sagging porch and windows that reflected the sky like dead eyes. A low stone wall, crumbling in places, separated their property from the woods. Smoke rose from the chimney in thin, reluctant wisps, as if even the fire was struggling to survive. Robert Graves was a barrel maker by trade, though work had become scarce. He was 41, broad-shouldered but stooped, with thick hands permanently stained by wood varnish and a face that rarely showed expression. He spoke little. He drank more than he used to. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire and stare into the flames as if looking for something he'd lost. His wife, Margaret Graves, had once been considered beautiful. At 36, she still retained traces of it: high cheekbones, dark hair shot through with premature gray-green eyes that seemed to hold storms. But there was something broken in her now, something that made people uncomfortable when they looked at her too long. She rarely came to town. When she did, she moved quickly, head down, speaking only when necessary. There were bruises, sometimes, hidden beneath high collars and long sleeves. People noticed. People said nothing. And then there was Lillian. Lillian Graves was 7 years old, small for her age, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent in certain light and dark hair that hung straight to her shoulders. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale gray, almost colorless, unsettling in their intensity. She had delicate features, doll-like, beautiful in the way that antique porcelain is beautiful, perfect, fragile, somehow unreal. But it was her silence that people remembered most. Lillian did not speak, not a word, not since she was 3 years old. The town doctor, old Benjamin Hale, had examined her multiple times. "Nothing physically wrong with the child," he'd pronounced, shaking his head. "Her vocal cords are intact. Her hearing is fine. It's something else." Something in the mind, perhaps. Margaret Graves insisted her daughter could speak, that she had spoken in full sentences until the day she simply stopped. But no one in Crow's End could remember ever hearing Lillian's voice. Some whispered that she'd been born mute and the mother had invented the memory of speech out of grief or madness. Lillian attended school, sitting in the back corner of Miss Mercer's classroom, always alone. She completed her lessons without difficulty. Her handwriting was neat, her arithmetic accurate. But she never raised her hand, never asked questions, never played with the other children at recess. Instead, she would stand at the edge of the schoolyard, perfectly still, watching, just watching. The other children were afraid of her. They called her names when the teacher wasn't listening. Ghost girl, the silent one. Witch. They said she brought bad luck. That animals died when she looked at them, that she could hear your thoughts if you got too close. Children are cruel, but sometimes children know things adults refuse to see. It began 3 days before Christmas. The morning was brutally cold, the kind of cold that turned breath into ice crystals and made skin burn. The sun rose late and weak, casting long shadows across the snow. Edmund Whitlock opened his general store at 7, as he did every morning. The bell above the door chimed its familiar note as he stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. The store was dark, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs and the faint sweetness of bulk sugar. He was lighting the oil lamps when he noticed it. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible, whispering. Edmund froze, lamp in hand, listening. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not words exactly, more like the ghost of words, the shape of language without meaning. His heart began to pound. "Hello?" he called out. "Who's there?" The whispering stopped. Edmund searched the entire store, the back room, the cellar, even the narrow space behind the shelves where he kept overstock. Nothing. No one. He convinced himself he'd imagined it. Nerves, the cold, the loneliness of winter mornings. But then it happened again, and again. Different places, different people. Miss Mercer heard it in her empty classroom after the children had gone home, a susurrus of voices that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Silas Cord heard it in his tavern at closing time, a murmuring that made the hair on his arms stand up. Reverend Ashford heard it in his church during evening prayers, whispers echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling like a congregation of ghosts. And they all described it the same way, like someone was telling secrets, urgent secrets. Secrets that needed to be heard but could not, would not, be understood. By December 23rd, the entire town was on edge. People spoke in hushed tones. They looked over their shoulders. They locked their doors earlier. There was a quality to the air, a tension, a wrongness, that made even the bravest men walk faster through the streets after dark. Then, on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, everything changed. Benjamin Cartwright was 11 years old, the son of the town's blacksmith. He was walking home from the harbor, where he'd been watching the boats, taking a shortcut through the woods that bordered the Graves property. The snow was deep off the path. His legs ached from the effort of pushing through it. The trees stood silent and still around him, their branches heavy with ice. That's when he saw her. Lillian Graves, standing in a small clearing about 30 yards from the path. Alone. Perfectly motionless, wearing only a thin gray dress despite the freezing cold. No coat, no shoes. Her bare feet disappeared into the snow. Benjamin stopped, his breath catching. Something about the scene was deeply wrong. Lillian stood facing away from him, her back rigid, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening to something. Her dark hair hung motionless despite the wind that stirred the branches above. "Lillian!" Benjamin called out, his voice cracking. "Are you all right?" She didn't move, didn't turn around. Benjamin took a step closer, then another. His boots crunched in the snow, too loud in the suffocating quiet of the forest. "Lillian, you're going to freeze. You need to go home." Still nothing. Just that terrible, unnatural stillness. Benjamin was about to turn and run for help when Lillian's head began to move. Slowly, mechanically, she turned to face him. Her eyes were open, wide open, staring. But they were wrong. The pale gray irises had no focus, no life. It was like looking at the eyes of a statue or a doll, or something that had never been alive to begin with. And then her mouth opened. Benjamin couldn't hear the words, if there were words, but he could see her lips moving, rapidly, continuously, forming shapes, syllables, sentences. Her jaw worked mechanically, relentlessly, as if she were speaking at impossible speed. But no sound came out. No sound at all. Benjamin Cartwright ran. He crashed through the forest, branches tearing at his clothes, snow filling his boots, his heart hammering so hard he thought it would burst. He didn't stop running until he reached Main Street, didn't stop screaming until his father grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him. "The Graves girl," Benjamin sobbed. "In the woods. She's... But he couldn't find the words to describe what he'd seen. By the time a search party reached the clearing, Lillian was gone. They found only her footprints in the snow, small, bare, leading deeper into the forest before disappearing entirely, as if she'd simply vanished into the winter air. And in the center of the clearing, trampled into the snow, they found words. Letters formed by dozens of tiny footprints, as if someone had walked the same pattern over and over again until the message was clear. "They told me everything I know, what you did, I know your secrets." No one in the search party spoke as they read those words. They stood in the frozen clearing as darkness gathered, as the temperature dropped, as the first stars appeared in the black sky above. Because they all understood in that moment that something terrible had begun. Something that wouldn't end until every secret in Crow's End had been dragged into the light. Lillian Graves was found 3 hours later, unconscious in her own bed, her feet blackened with frostbite, her lips still moving soundlessly even in sleep. The doctor couldn't explain it. Her parents couldn't explain it. But as Christmas morning dawned cold and merciless over Crow's End, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The little girl who couldn't speak had found another way to tell what she knew. And in a town built on buried secrets and unspoken sins, that was the most dangerous thing of all. Lillian Graves opened her eyes on Christmas morning, and when she did, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Dr. Benjamin Hale stood beside her bed, his breath turning to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Margaret Graves clutched her daughter's hand, her knuckles white, tears streaming down her face. Robert Graves stood in the doorway, motionless as a tombstone, watching with those dead eyes that gave nothing away. The child's lips had stopped moving. The frostbite on her feet had somehow, impossibly, begun to heal overnight, the blackened flesh turning pink again, as if time itself was running backward through her small body. "Lillian," Dr. Hale whispered, leaning close. "Can you hear me?" The girl's pale, gray eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him recoil. She didn't blink. Didn't breathe, it seemed, just stared with an expression that was not quite human, not quite anything he could name. Then, slowly, deliberately, Lillian raised one small finger and pointed. Not at the doctor, not at her mother, at her father. Robert Graves' face remained impassive, but his hands curled into fists at his sides. "She doesn't know what she's doing," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "She's confused. The cold has nothing to do with it." The voice that came from Lillian's mouth was not a child's voice. It was layered, multiple, as if a dozen people were speaking in perfect unison through her small throat. "The cold is the only thing that keeps the whispers quiet. But they won't be quiet anymore," Margaret Graves screamed. The doctor stumbled backward, knocking over his medical bag, instruments clattering across the wooden floor. Robert Graves stood frozen, his face finally showing emotion, pure, undiluted terror. Then Lillian's eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed against the pillows, unconscious once more. But the damage was done. The child who couldn't speak had spoken, and what she said would tear Crow's End apart at its rotting foundations. By noon, the entire town knew. Whispers spread faster than wildfire through the snow-covered streets. People gathered in clusters outside the general store, the tavern, the church. Everyone had the same question on their lips. What did the Graves girl mean? But deeper than that question was another unspoken fear. What does she know? Edmund Whitlock closed his store early. He went home to his empty house above the shop, locked every door and window, and sat in the darkness with his dead wife's photograph clutched in his shaking hands. The whispering he'd heard 3 days ago returned, louder now, more insistent, and this time he could almost make out words. "Tell them. Tell them what you did. Tell them about the fire." Miss Caroline Mercer stood at the window of her boarding house room, staring out at the gray ocean crashing against the cliffs. Her reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, pale, haunted, guilty. She touched the silver locket around her neck, the one she never took off, the one that held a secret she'd traveled 300 miles to escape. Behind her, she could hear it. That same susurrus of voices, growing stronger, growing clearer. "He trusted you. He loved you. And you let him die." In the Greyhound Tavern, Silas Cord poured himself a drink with trembling hands. The names he whispered to himself at night, the names of men who died beside him at Gettysburg. Those names were speaking back now, not in memory but in reality, voices coming from the walls, from the bottles behind the bar, from the shadows in the corners. You ran. When they needed you, you ran. Coward, coward, coward. And in the church, Reverend Thomas Ashford knelt before the altar, praying with a desperation that bordered on madness. But the whispers drowned out his prayers, whispers that knew things, whispers that accused. "Man of God, man of lies, you wear righteousness like a mask, but underneath you're rotting. We can smell it, we can see it. We know what you did to her." All across Crow's End, in every home, every heart, the secrets people had buried were clawing their way back to the surface. And at the center of it all was a 7-year-old girl who shouldn't be able to speak, but somehow knew everything. On the second day after Christmas, Miss Caroline Mercer came to the Graves house. She stood on the sagging porch, snow falling around her like ash, her face set with grim determination. When Margaret Graves answered the door, Caroline pushed past her without asking permission. "I need to see Lillian," she said. "Now." Margaret's green eyes were red from crying, dark circles beneath them like bruises. "She's sleeping. The doctor said—" "I don't care what the doctor said." Caroline's voice was sharp, desperate. "She spoke through me last night. In my dreams. She told me things. Things I've never told anyone. Things no one could possibly know. I need to understand what's happening." They found Lillian in her small bedroom at the top of the stairs. The child sat on the edge of her bed, fully awake, dressed in a white nightgown, her dark hair hanging loose around her pale face. She was drawing something on a piece of paper with a black crayon, her movements precise and deliberate. Caroline approached slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. "Lillian, can you hear me?" The girl didn't look up, didn't stop drawing. "What are you?" Caroline whispered. "What's happened to you?" Finally, Lillian raised her head. Her colorless eyes met Caroline's, and the teacher saw something in them that made her blood turn to ice. Knowledge. Ancient, terrible knowledge that should never exist behind the eyes of a child. When Lillian spoke, her voice was her own this time, small, clear, heartbreakingly young. "They came to me in the cold," she said. "The ones who died here. The ones who were forgotten. The ones who were silenced. They've been waiting so long to be heard. And when I stopped speaking, when I made myself empty, they filled me up. All their voices, all their stories, all their pain." Caroline's legs gave out. She sank to her knees beside the bed. Who came to you?" Lillian's small finger traced across the drawing she'd made. It showed the town square, the church, and beneath it, scratched in heavy black crayon, dozens of small figures. Bodies. Buried bodies. "The children," Lillian whispered. "The lost children of Crow's End. 23 of them, missing over 40 years. Everyone thought they ran away, or were taken by wolves, or drowned in the harbor." She looked up at Caroline, and a single tear rolled down her porcelain cheek. "But they didn't run away. They were taken, buried, forgotten, and the man who took them, he's still here, still watching, still waiting." The room seemed to tilt. Caroline gripped the edge of the bed to steady herself. Who? Who did it?" Lillian's mouth opened, but before she could answer, a sound erupted from downstairs. A crash, a shout, the slam of a door. Both Caroline and Margaret ran to the stairs. Robert Graves was gone. The front door hung open, swinging in the winter wind, and in the snow outside, they could see his boot prints leading toward the forest, leading toward the church. The entire town converged on the church that afternoon. Drawn by instinct, by fear, by the overwhelming sense that something had to break, had to end, had to finally be revealed. Reverend Thomas Ashford stood at the pulpit, his face gray as the winter sky. Before him, the pews filled with the people of Crow's End, fishermen and merchants, wives and widows, the young and the old, all of them silent, all of them waiting. Robert Graves stood at the back of the church, breathing hard from his run through the snow. In his hand, he held a shovel. Its blade was crusted with frozen earth. "I dug," Robert said, his voice carrying through the silent space. "Behind the church, where the old cemetery used to be before they built the new one. I dug where my daughter told me to dig." He threw something onto the floor. It rolled down the center aisle, small and white and unmistakable. A human skull, the skull of a child. Women gasped, men stood. Reverend Ashford gripped the edges of the pulpit, his knuckles white. "This church," Robert continued, his voice breaking, "was built in 1828. My daughter showed me a vision, a memory that wasn't hers, couldn't be hers. She showed me what happened here. What's been hidden here for 44 years. Silas Cord rose from his pew. "Robert, what are you saying?" "I'm saying the children didn't disappear. They were taken. By someone they trusted, someone who preached to them about goodness and sin, someone who built this church on top of their bones." All eyes turned to Reverend Ashford. The Reverend's face had gone completely white. His hands trembled so violently he had to clutch the pulpit to stay upright. I wasn't even born when those children... This is madness. This is... Not you, came a voice from the back of the church. Lillian Graves stood in the doorway, small and pale in her white nightgown, barefoot in the snow. Beside her stood Dr. Benjamin Hale, his face grave. The child walked down the aisle, her footsteps making no sound. She stopped at the front pew and pointed to an old man sitting alone in the corner, a man so ancient and bent that most people barely noticed him anymore, a man who came to every service but never spoke to anyone. Cyrus Ashford, the Reverend's grandfather, 91 years old, the former minister of Crow's End, retired 30 years ago. Him, Lillian said in that clear, terrible child's voice. The voices showed me. He was young then, handsome, trusted, and he had a sickness inside him, a hunger. The children would come to him for lessons, for guidance, and he would take them, one by one, over 3 years, 23 children, and when people asked questions, he would say they'd run away, that they'd been tempted by sin, that their families had failed them. Cyrus Ashford didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, his rheumy eyes fixed on nothing. The voices wanted me to tell, Lillian continued. They've been waiting, trapped, screaming in silence, just like me. The old man finally stirred, his lips pulled back in something that might have been a smile. Clever child, he whispered, his voice like dry leaves. But you're too late. I've had a good life, a long life, and when I die, which will be soon, I'll take my peace with me. No, Lillian said softly, you won't. She walked to the old man and placed her small hand on his weathered one, and Cyrus Ashford began to scream. They said the old man screamed for 6 hours straight before his heart finally gave out. They said his eyes had gone completely white, as if he was looking at something no one else could see. Something terrible. Something that had been waiting for him on the other side for 44 years. They said that when he died, the whispering in Crow's End finally stopped. But Lillian Graves stood at the window of her bedroom that night, watching the snow fall, and she knew the truth. The whispers hadn't stopped. They'd simply moved on, because there were other towns, other secrets, other children who couldn't speak, and the dead were very, very patient. They buried the children properly in the spring, when the ground finally thawed. 23 small graves in the new cemetery, each marked with a simple white cross. Most bore no names. After 44 years, no one could remember all the children who'd vanished, or which bones belonged to whom. But they were laid to rest with dignity, with prayers, with tears from parents who'd died never knowing what happened to their sons and daughters, and from grandchildren who'd grown up hearing ghost stories about the lost ones. Reverend Thomas Ashford left Crow's End 3 days after his grandfather's death. He couldn't bear to look at the church anymore, couldn't stand in a pulpit built on top of graves. Some said he joined a monastery in New Hampshire. Others said he simply disappeared, another ghost added to Maine's endless fog. The church itself stood empty for 2 months before the town council voted to tear it down. Edmund Whitlock bought the lumber at auction. Good wood shouldn't go to waste, he reasoned, though he couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes when he said it. He planned to use it to repair his store, but Miss Caroline Mercer had stopped him on Main Street, her hand on his arm, her voice low and urgent. Don't, please. Some things should be left to rot. Some things should be forgotten. Edmund had nodded, understanding in a way that went beyond words. The lumber was burned instead. The church's foundation was torn up, the earth beneath blessed and salted and left bare. Where the building had stood, nothing would grow for years. But the questions remained. How had Lillian known? How had she seen things that happened decades before she was born? How had she spoken with voices that weren't her own? And most disturbing of all, was it over? Dr. Benjamin Hale came to the Graves house on a gray morning in early March. He found Margaret in the kitchen, kneading bread with mechanical precision, her hands white with flour. She looked older now, harder. The brittleness that had always been in her had calcified into something unbreakable. "How is she?" the doctor asked. Margaret didn't look up from her work. "She speaks now, regular sentences, like nothing ever happened. She asks for breakfast. She plays with her doll. She's—" Margaret's voice cracked. "She's just a little girl again. And Robert?" Margaret's hand stilled. "He left, 2 weeks ago. Took what money we had and disappeared. I don't expect him back." The doctor nodded slowly. He'd suspected as much. Men like Robert Graves couldn't bear to be near things they didn't understand. Couldn't bear to look at their own failures reflected in their children's eyes. "May I see her?" Lillian was in the small parlor, sitting on the floor with a cloth doll in her lap. She looked up when the doctor entered and smiled, a normal, bright 7-year-old smile. "Hello, Dr. Hale." Her voice was her own. Light, musical, utterly ordinary. "Hello, Lillian." He sat down in the worn armchair across from her, his old bones creaking. "I wanted to ask you something, if you're willing to talk about it." The girl's smile faded slightly, but she nodded. "What happened to you? In the woods, before Christmas? What came into you?" Lillian was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers adjusting her doll's dress with meticulous care. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful, measured beyond her years. "I was always different," she said. "Even before I stopped talking. I could hear things, feel things, like the world was whispering to me all the time. Mama's sadness, Papa's anger, the way the whole town felt sick, like rotting wood under paint." She looked up at him with those unsettling gray eyes. "When I was 3, I saw something. Papa was hurting Mama, really hurting her. I tried to scream for help, but he—" She paused, her small face clouding. "He put his hand over my mouth so hard I couldn't breathe. And something inside me just closed, like a door slamming shut. I couldn't speak after that. Couldn't even try." Dr. Hale felt his chest tighten with rage and sorrow. "But when I went silent," Lillian continued, "I became empty, and empty things get filled. The dead children, the ones buried under the church. They'd been trying to be heard for so long. And when they found someone who could carry their voices, they poured into me. All of them at once." "Why you?" the doctor asked gently. "Why not someone else?" Lillian's smile was sad and ancient. "Because I understood. I knew what it was like to have a voice stolen, to have secrets you couldn't tell, to be buried alive in silence while the world just kept going, pretending nothing was wrong." She stood up, setting her doll carefully on the chair, and walked to the window. Outside, the last of winter's snow was melting, revealing the brown earth beneath. "They showed me everything," she said softly. "Not just about Cyrus Ashford, about everyone, every secret, every sin, every little cruelty that people hide because they're afraid of judgment." She turned back to the doctor. "Edmund Whitlock started the fire that killed his wife and baby. He was drunk, knocked over a lamp, and instead of trying to save them, he ran, saved himself, let them burn." Dr. Hale's breath caught. "Miss Mercer wasn't running from Boston. She was running from a man she poisoned, her husband. He beat her, and one night she put arsenic in his tea. No one ever suspected. No one ever will." "Lillian." "Silas Core didn't run from battle because he was scared. He ran because he was stealing from the dead, Confederate and Union both. Gold teeth, wedding rings, pocket watches. He came home rich while better men died." "Stop." But Lillian wasn't finished. Her voice remained calm, factual, devastating. "And Reverend Ashford knew. He knew what his grandfather was. He found bones in the cellar when he was a boy. But he was afraid of shame, afraid of losing his position, so he covered them up and pretended he never saw. 30 years of preaching about sin while standing on top of murdered children. Dr. Hale stood, his legs shaking. "Why are you telling me this?" Lillian's expression softened. "Because you asked, and because you're different. You never hurt anyone. You just tried to help, even when helping was impossible. You were kind to me when no one else was." She walked back to him and took his weathered hand in her small one. "The voices are gone now. They said what they needed to say. They found their peace. But I remember everything they showed me. Every secret in this town. Every lie. Every hidden thing." She squeezed his hand gently. "I won't tell. I won't become what Cyrus Ashford was, someone who uses knowledge to hurt people. But I'll remember. And that memory will be enough. Because people can feel it when someone really sees them, really knows them. And that changes things, makes them more careful, more honest, more human." Spring came slowly to Crow's End that year, as if the earth itself was reluctant to wake up. The town was quieter now. People spoke less, smiled less. There was a guardedness that hadn't been there before, a sense that everyone was watching everyone else, wondering what they knew, what they'd heard during those terrible days when the whispers filled every corner. Edmund Whitlock sold his store and moved to Portland. Miss Carolyn Mercer stayed, but she was different, softer somehow, less judgmental, as if her own shame had taught her compassion. Silas Cord stopped drinking. Started attending the small services held in the town hall now that the church was gone. He never explained why. People said Crow's End had been cleansed, that the evil had been rooted out and destroyed, that they could move forward now, build something better. But Dr. Benjamin Hale knew the truth. Evil hadn't been destroyed. It had simply been exposed. And exposure didn't erase what people had done, didn't unburn Edmund's wife, didn't unpoison Caroline's husband, didn't unbury 23 children. It just meant everyone had to live with it now, live with the knowledge, live with the shame, and that, perhaps, was the real punishment. On the last day of March, Margaret Graves came to the doctor's office. She was alone, her face drawn, but determined. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about Lillian, about why she really stopped speaking." Dr. Hale gestured to a chair. Margaret sat, her hands folded in her lap, knuckles white. "Robert did hurt her that night," Margaret began. "But it wasn't what you think. It wasn't violent. It was worse." She took a shaking breath. "Lillian saw something she wasn't supposed to see. There was a girl, a young woman. She'd come to the house looking for work. Robert, he took her to the barn. I knew what he was doing. I'd always known. But I pretended not to, because I was afraid. Afraid he'd hurt me worse if I said anything. Afraid he'd leave and we'd starve." Tears began to fall, but Margaret's voice remained steady. "Lillian followed him, saw what he did to that girl. And when she came back to the house, she was going to tell me, going to ask questions. So Robert, he told her that if she ever spoke about what she saw, he would do the same thing to me. Kill me, bury me where no one would find me. And Lillian, she was only 3 years old, but she understood. She understood that her voice could kill me." Margaret looked up at the doctor, her green eyes swimming with anguish. "So she stopped talking, for 4 years, to protect me. A child, a baby, carrying that weight, that silence. And I let her. God help me. I let her." Dr. Hale felt his own eyes burning. "What happened to the girl? The young woman?" "Robert said she ran off, went west. But I know. I've always known. She's out there somewhere, in the woods, in the ground. Another secret. Another ghost." She stood, straightening her skirt with trembling hands. "I'm leaving Crow's End," she said, "taking Lillian with me. We're going to Boston. My sister lives there. She's offered to help. Lillian deserves better than this place, better than me." better than all of this. She deserves a mother who protects her, the doctor said gently. Margaret flinched as if struck. I know. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be that. Trying to make up for what I didn't do. What I should have done. She walked to the door, then paused. The dead children spoke through my daughter, she said quietly. But maybe she was one of them all along. A dead child, buried alive in silence. And maybe now, finally, she can start to live. The letter arrived at Dr. Benjamin Hale's office on a crisp October morning in 1892. He was 79 now, still practicing medicine, though his hands shook and his eyes were failing. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Elegant, precise, impossibly familiar despite the decades. Dear Dr. Hale, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted you to know that I've thought of you often over the years. Your kindness meant more to me than you could possibly know. I'm 27 now, a teacher, like Miss Mercer was. I work at a school for girls in Boston. Many of my students come from difficult homes, violent homes. I understand them in ways other teachers cannot. I help them find their voices. I show them that silence isn't safety, that speaking truth, even when it's terrifying, is the only way to survive, the only way to live. I never married, never wanted to. I've seen too much of what men can do, what families can hide. But I'm happy. I have my students, I have my work, I have a voice. Mother passed away 2 years ago, peacefully, in her sleep. We had reconciled mostly. She never quite forgave herself, but she tried. She tried to be better. And in the end, that was enough. I wanted to tell you something else. Something I never told anyone. When the dead children's voices left me, they gave me a gift. A burden, maybe, but also a gift. I can still hear them. Not the dead children, but the living ones. The ones who can't speak. The ones who've been silenced by fear or trauma or violence. When I'm near them, I can feel their secrets pressing against my mind like whispers. I can sense what they can't say, and I help them. I find ways to make them safe, to give them the courage to speak, to show them that someone finally hears them. Crow's End taught me that every town has secrets, every family has ghosts, every silence hides a scream. But it also taught me that the voiceless can find power in unexpected ways. That truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. And that sometimes, the greatest courage isn't in speaking. It's in finally learning to be silent long enough to hear someone else's pain. Thank you for hearing mine. With gratitude and respect, Lillian Graves, Dr. Benjamin Hale sat in his office as the afternoon light faded, the letter in his trembling hands. Outside, the world moved on as it always did. Children playing, merchants closing their shops, the ocean crashing eternal against the rocky shore. But inside his quiet office, the old doctor wept. For the children who'd been silenced, for the girl who'd carried their voices, and for the long, terrible weight of secrets that every town, every person, every heart must eventually learn to bear, or break beneath. The end. Lillian Graves disappeared from public record in 1903. Some say she continued teaching until her death in 1940. Others claim she vanished into the Western Territories, still searching for the silenced, the lost, the ones who couldn't speak. Crow's End, Maine, became a ghost town by 1920. The harbor silted up. The fishing died. The people left. But visitors to the abandoned cemetery still report strange sounds on winter nights. Whispers, voices of children, telling secrets no one can quite hear, but everyone can feel.